And that's why he says, foolishly, I thank thee that I am not as other men are, extortioners. I am not an extortioner, says the Pharisee. But he is. He is an extortioner. If he really understood the commandments of God's law, he would have to confess, I am an extortioner because I am covetous in my heart. That makes me an extortioner. I am not an adulterer either, he says, but if he understood the law of God, if he had been paying attention as he went around listening to the sermons of Jesus, he would have understood that he is an adulterer in his heart because he lusts after other women in his heart. He has a heart filled with lust and hatred towards God. He is emphatically an adulterer. And he's unjust too, because he does not match up to the perfect standard of God. He deviates from that standard. He sins. That makes him unjust. But there's a danger for us in looking at this well-known parable. We are in danger of responding with a certain amount of smugness. And even with a parody of the Pharisee's prayer, which goes along these lines, God, I thank thee that I am not like this Pharisee. I am a Christian. I believe the gospel. I am a member of a Reformed church. I am not like this Pharisee. But that would be a dreadful mistake. That would be to miss the point of Jesus' parable. Because his aim here is not simply to expose self-righteousness in the crowd which were before him, and especially in the Pharisee. His aim here is to expose self-righteousness in the church of every age. In me and in you, in us as a congregation, because there is much more of the Pharisee in each one of us than we would care to admit. And we need therefore to examine ourselves under this word of Christ. Are we Pharisees? Are we self-righteous? What is our attitude, for example, as we come into the house of God, the equivalent of the temple in public worship? That was what the Pharisee, after all, was doing. He was coming into the temple of God to worship God, he said. And his attitude was one of pride. He wanted to come into the temple of God so others would see him there and think, oh my, what a righteous, religious, pious person that is. And how often is that not found in our hearts as a motive to come to church? I hope I'm seen. I hope people know I was there and will admire me for my participation in the worship of God. And do we come to the worship services to hear what the Word of God says and to humble ourselves under that Word? Or do we come to the worship services to hear what the Word of God says about other people in the church and not about us ourselves? So we are saying to ourselves as we hear the sermon, I hope that he's listening to this morning, or I hope that she's listening to this sermon this morning. This sermon points out exactly his sin or her sin, and then we forget that every sermon points out our own sin, because every sin described in the Bible is present in our own sinful flesh and will come to expression if we do not fight against it. And do we come to church to hear the Word of God, to be thankful for the gospel of Christ, to hear the comfort of that gospel, or do we come to church to earn the favor of God and think in that way we save ourselves. And what about our attitude to the other members of the church? Look at the Pharisee again. He compares himself with everyone else in the church of that day. I thank thee that I am not as other men are. He lists all the sins of which everyone else in the church is guilty, but from which he himself is exempt. He loves to compare himself with others. And how much of that is found in us as we come to church? I might be a sinner, but I'm not as bad as he is, or I'm not as bad as she is. And did you hear what he did? And did you hear what she did? Or did you see what their children did? I am glad that I am not as they are. I thank thee that I am not as other men are. And those are the attitudes of self-righteousness which Jesus Christ is exposing in this parable. And our calling is to fight against self-righteousness. Our calling is to live in humility before God, the high and holy one, but also before one another in the church. Our calling then is to esteem everyone else in the church not as a greater sinner than we are, but as one who is better than we are. And if that was our attitude toward the other members of the church all the time, then every church of Jesus Christ would be filled with harmony and peace. And all the marriages and all the homes would be filled with such harmony and peace. But instead we want to be flattered, we want to be praised, we resist the gospel of Christ because we do not like to hear that all of our salvation is found in Him. And there's absolutely nothing in us that is good. And we must rely entirely on the grace of God for all things. And as we come to understand our own sinful hearts, and how much self-righteousness is really in there, and how much pride lurks in there, our prayer will be, God, be merciful to me, a Pharisee. A Pharisee. But there were two men who went up into the temple that day. And Jesus puts them, as it were, side by side. They go up to the temple at the same time. And they are complete opposites. And the people of that day would have been shocked and disgusted that Jesus would dare to mention in the same breath as this wonderfully pious Pharisee, this miserable, wretched, unclean publican. How dare he have the gall and the presumption, they would say, to go into the temple and expect to be heard by God? Of course God will hear the publican, but never, never will He hear the publican. But Jesus describes these two men as opposites. Utter opposites. They're opposites, first of all, in their attitude to God. Remember, the publican boasts in the presence of God. The publican comes into the temple and he will not even look up into heaven. He's so ashamed of himself. He looks downwards. He beats upon his breast. He finds some insignificant corner in which to cower because he does not want to get too close to the holy place of God. And he asks God for mercy. He humbles himself, Jesus said.